So today we have two books we're going to be reading, or two chapters of the book of Daniel that we're going to be reading. You do not have to stand for the whole thing. If you are more comfortable sitting or want to sit halfway through, that is fine as well. We're going to start in chapter 7, which is what we had read last week as well. And then chapter 8 is another dream and prophecy for Daniel that Dan is going to be going through more today. So Daniel chapter 7. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying in his bed, and he wrote down the substance of his dream. Daniel said, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me were 4 winds of heaven, churning up the great sea. 4 great beasts, each different from the other, came up out of the sea. The first was a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle, and I watched until its wings were tore off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a man, and the heart of man was given to it. And there before me was a second beast, and it looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, 'Get up and eat your fill of flesh.' After that I looked, and there was before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard, and on its back had 4 wings, like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. After that in my vision at night I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying, frightening, and powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a man, and the mouth that spoke boastfully. As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing were white as snow, and the hair on his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming and with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. Then I continued to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking, and I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, and men of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion and will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. I, Daniel, was troubled in spirit at the visions that passed through my mind. They disturbed me. I approached one of those standing there and asked him the true meaning of all this. So he told me and gave me the interpretation of these things. The 4 great beasts are 4 kingdoms that will rise from the earth, but the saints of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever, yes, forever and ever. Then I wanted to know the true meaning of the 4th beast, which was different from the others and the most terrifying. With its iron teeth and bronze claws, the beast that crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. I also want to know about the 10 horns on its head, about the other horn that came up, and before the 3 of them fell, the horn that looked more imposing than the others, and that had eyes and a mouth that spoke boastfully. As I watched, this horn was waging war against the saints and defeating them, until the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in favor of the saints and of the Most High. And the time came when they possessed the kingdom. He gave me this explanation. The 4th beast is a 4th kingdom that will appear on earth. It will be different from all the other kingdoms and will devour the whole earth, trampling it down and crushing it. The 10 horns are 10 kings who will come from this kingdom. After them, other kings will arise, different from the earlier ones. He will subdue 3 kings. He will speak against the Most High and oppress his saints and try to change the set times and the laws. The saints will be handed over to him for a time, times, and half a time. But the court will sit, and his power will be taken away and completely destroyed forever. Then the sovereignty, power, and greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be handed over to the saints, the people of the Most High. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all rulers will worship and obey him. This is the end of the matter. I, Daniel, was deeply troubled by my thoughts, and my face turned pale, but I kept the matter to myself. So these are terrifying images of the last times that Dan had spoken about, and is going to speak about more today. But as we start talking more about the end times, and the end times are important for us to know because we're told, because we have discernment, that we'll see these things coming. And like Dan talked about, they're not yet here. But let's not forget how we're supposed to be living, right, when we're approaching the end times. We're supposed to live a little bit differently than the rest of the world lives. So I just wanted to read Matthew 7:12 real quick. It says, "So in everything do to others what you would have them do to you. For this sums up the law of the prophets." So when we translate that, it really means that we have to treat others exactly the way that you want to be treated in any situation. Really, it's the golden rule. So it doesn't matter what the times are like, it's how we're supposed to live. Because what we're supposed to be doing is before this time comes at the end, we're supposed to be making sure that we're helping people understand that there's another kingdom, and how do we bring more people in the kingdom. And we can't be offended by people. And that's the easiest thing to do, is say, well, I'm offended by what you say. We're not supposed to be offended. We're just supposed to love people. And if they see us so vastly different than how they are thinking and treating people, they'll want to know why you're so calm in these tumultuous times. And so that's how we're supposed to be. Let's read chapter 8. In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision after the one that had already appeared to me. In my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa in the province of Elam. In the vision, I was beside Ulai canal. And I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns, standing beside the canal. And the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. I watched the ram as he charged towards the west and towards the north and the south. No animal could stand against him, and none could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between his eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. He came toward the 2-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal and charged at him with great rage. I saw him attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering his 2 horns. The ram was powerless to stand against him. The goat knocked him to the ground and trampled on him, and none could rescue the ram from his power. The goat became very great, but at the height of his power, his large horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up towards the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came another horn, which started small but grew in power in the south and to the east and towards the beautiful land. It grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. It set itself up to be as great as the prince of the host. It took away the daily sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was brought low. Because of rebellion, the host of the saints and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. Then I heard the Holy One speaking to another Holy One, and another Holy One said to him, "How long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled, the vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, and the surrender of the sanctuary and of the hosts that will be trampled underfoot?" He said to me, "It will take 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated." When I, Daniel, was watching the vision and trying to understand it, there before me stood the one who looked like a man. And I heard a man's voice from the Ulai calling, "Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision." As he came near the place where I was standing, I was terrified and fell prostrate. "Son of man," he said to me, "understand that the vision concerns the time of the end." When he was speaking to me, I was in a deep sleep, and my face to the ground. Then he touched me, and he raised me to my feet. He said, "I am going to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath. because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. The two-horned ram and you saw presents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn between his eyes is the first king. The four horns that replace the one that was broken off represent four kingdoms that will emerge from his nation, but will not have the same power. In the latter part of the reign, when the rebels have been completely wicked, a stern-faced king, master of intrigue, will arise. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy the mighty men of the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take a stand against the prince of princes. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. The vision of evenings and mornings that has been given to you is true. But seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future. I, Daniel, was exhausted and lay ill for several days. Then I got up and I went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding. This is the word.
Well, we've been talking about prophecy and predictive prophecy. And I mentioned this quote from J. Barton Payne that 27% of the Bible is predictive prophecy. Over 1,800 prophetic declarations that God had given, and over 900 of them have been fulfilled already. And so we talked last week about how if you go through the book of Genesis, you see prophecy after prophecy after prophecy, where God had told people ahead of time what was going to happen. In fact, many of these things were the reason why people got activated in following God, because God gave them a promise about the future. He told them something would happen if they followed Him. And so they did follow Him, and those things came to pass. Today I want to reflect a little bit on the book of Exodus. Beginning of the book of Exodus, the situation that the Jews find themselves in is what God had talked about in Genesis 15. God had told Abram at that time in a vision, that his descendants would be strangers in a land not theirs. They would be enslaved and oppressed. And so in Exodus we find that's what happened. A Pharaoh arose who did not know who Joseph was. The Israelites had multiplied and become numerous, and the Egyptians were afraid of them, so they put them into bondage, put them into slavery in order to keep them under control. That's the beginning of the story. And then we have the account of Moses' birth and his attempt to try to deliver his people, and he ends up having to flee for his life and spends 40 years in isolation in the desert. And then one day he sees a burning bush, a bush that's on fire but it's not being consumed. So he goes over to see this strange sight, he refers to it as. And when he comes near, it's Yahweh, it's God. And he says, "Take off your sandals, for the place you're standing on is holy ground." And Yahweh begins to tell him things that are going to happen. He begins to tell him promises, that he is the one who is going to deliver the Israelites from Egypt. And then he tells Moses, "Now go and deliver the people." And Moses says, "What? Who am I? I'm nobody." What? And he has got all these excuses. But God won't accept the excuses. Moses is the one He's chosen. Moses is the one who's supposed to go. And so God sends Moses and He prepares him for what's going to happen. He says, when you get there, the people will listen to you. The Jewish people will listen to you. And when you'll go to talk to Pharaoh, he won't listen to you. But I will deliver my people with a powerful hand. I will multiply my plagues. My plagues will be directed against the gods of Egypt. I will make a name for myself. And I will deliver my people in a powerful way from the Egyptians, and I will get glory for my name. He tells them plague after plague after plague. He tells them what's going to happen before it happens. Moses goes into Pharaoh. Pharaoh rejects Moses' demand that he release the Israelites. And Moses will tell him, well, then this is going to happen. This plague is going to happen. And there's a few times where he even says the time it's going to happen. He even gives Pharaoh the opportunity to determine when. And it happens at that time. Those are all prophetic things. They're things that God is saying ahead of time that he brings to pass. And the biggest one, of course, is the plague of the firstborn, where God through Moses, tells the Israelites that they're to take a lamb and slay it and put the blood on the doorposts and the lintel of their house, because he's going to send a destroying angel through the land. And if the angel comes and sees the blood on the door of their house, he'll pass over their house. But any house that does not have blood on the door, he will kill the firstborn male in that house, both of people and of animals. And of course, that's the final straw that brings Pharaoh to his knees, so to speak, and he releases the Israelites. And then God tells him that Pharaoh's going to come after them. You know, they march out boldly and they think everything's good, and then God tells Moses Pharaoh's going to come after them. And sure enough, Pharaoh comes after them. Then God tells him they're camped by the sea, and he says, extend your staff and I'll split the sea, and you and the people of Israel will go through the sea on dry ground. And the Egyptians will try to follow you, and they will perish in the sea. Again, it's a prophetic thing. It's something that happened in the future. It hasn't happened yet. God's telling them what's going to happen. So all the way through the book, God does this again and again. When they're hungry, God says, I will do this. I will provide bread. You'll find it in the morning. It'll form on the vegetation. And the next morning they got up and there's this flake-like substance. They call it, what is it? That's what the word manna means. What is it? And they ate that bread for the next 40 years. God provided for them every day except on the Sabbath day, there was no bread. God said, I'm not going to give you bread on the seventh day. You need to take 2 days worth of bread on the sixth day. Again, these things are fulfilled in detail. So again, as we look at this whole idea of prophecy, we see that God obviously knows the future. He obviously knows the future, and he communicates to people what's going to happen. Both things that he does and things that are just going to happen that aren't something that he himself is engineering. Events that involve other people. So we need to understand that this is who Yahweh is. This is who God is. So we get to a book like Daniel, and we see these prophecies. We're not surprised. This is what God has shown himself to be throughout the whole book. The first day that I talked about this, I talked about how some people don't believe that God knows the future. They have this view of God that he's not sure, and that it depends on what we do. No, God knows the future. And I kept saying, have you read the book? Have you read the book? Because if you read the book, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. So we come to Daniel chapter 7 and Daniel 8. And Daniel tells us when he got these visions. Daniel chapter 7 is the first year of Belshazzar. Belshazzar became the regent king in 553 BC. So we know that Daniel received this vision 553 BC. Alexander the Great wasn't even born until 336 BC or something, 343. It's hundreds of years later. And Antiochus Epiphanes, the one who is the little horn, or seems to be the little horn, he doesn't show up till 170 BC. So Daniel's receiving prophecies about the future. And in chapter 8, he gets this second vision on the third year of Belshazzar's reign in 550 BC. Now, liberal scholars, people who don't believe God can know the future, they got a problem. Because if Daniel received this information hundreds of years ahead of time, how can they explain that? So what they have to do is they late date these prophecies, and they say, well, this didn't happen until after Antiochus Epiphanes lived. And Daniel must have falsely written this book under the name Daniel and applied all these dates and stuff to things in the past to make it look like he was prophesying. What? You're going to tell me that the God of truth used some guy who's a liar to write a book about something that never happened to make it look like it did? Doesn't make any sense, does it? No. The whole point of what Daniel is saying is that this is a divine mystery. This is something God revealed to him centuries ahead of time. Because he is the God who knows the future. Then he wants us to know that he's in charge. He wants us to know that this stuff is not happening outside of his oversight or his control. So that when we have to face difficult times, we know he's right here with us. He's walking with us. He's in the midst of our lives. Whatever we have to face, for good or evil, he is with us. And he has not abandoned us. So Daniel chapter 7, we have the different beasts. We have the lion that had his wings plucked and stood up on his feet like a man. That seems to be Nebuchadnezzar. Seems to be who he was. The lion referred to the Babylonians, and he had been someone who was disciplined by God and lost his reason, and then God gave him his mind back, and he exalted God. After he was gone and his kingdom, the Babylonians were gone, the next beast is a bear, a lopsided bear, a bear who's standing kind of lopsided. One side's higher than the other. And he's got 3 ribs in his mouth. That refers to the Medes and the Persians. The Medes and the Persians were a coalition of 2 kingdoms. The Medes were the first, and the Persians were the second. They joined together, and the Persians actually became greater than the Medes. And the 3 ribs were Lydia, which was what is Western Turkey today, Egypt, and Babylon. That's who that was. Then there's a leopard that runs across the ground. He's got 4 heads, and I can't remember all the details. But that's Alexander the Great, and the 4 heads refer to his 4 generals. And after Alexander conquers the land all the way from Egypt all the way to India, his troops are upset with him because they've been on the road for 10 years. They've been away from their families, away from Greece for 10 years. And they protest. And so he was going to go on. He was going to go into India and up further, but his men were complaining, so he went back. And while he was in Babylon, he got a sickness and he died. So his 4 generals split up his kingdom among themselves. And it says in the prophecy, to the 4 winds of heaven. That's exactly what they did. They went with the 4 points of the compass, and they divided the property, the land, into those areas. And the 2 that are significant, both in Daniel 7 and Daniel 8, are the one who is in what is now modern-day Turkey. It was called Asia at the time. That was the Seleucid dynasty. And the other one was the one who was down in Egypt. Those were the Ptolemies, Ptolemy, Ptolemy. Those 2 ended up having a lot of conflict back and forth, up and down. And who's right in the middle? Palestine. Israel's right in the middle. So in Daniel chapter 7, it's laying out this big picture of these kingdoms. The 4th kingdom, this last kingdom, is a horrible, terrible beast, more dreadful than all the rest. It's got large iron teeth, and it's crushing everything, and it's got bronze claws. And the whole purpose of that vision is that Daniel receives the vision that in the days of those kings, God will cut out a stone made without hands that will crush It will come against that, and it will crush it all. And it will make it like dust and blow it away. That kingdom will never come to an end. So that's referring to the kingdom of Jesus, of which we're a part. Those other kingdoms are long gone, but the kingdom of Jesus continues to spread. We're part of that kingdom, and wherever the gospel is being spread, people are coming to know Jesus. The kingdom continues to expand, and will be here until Jesus returns. Chapter 8 starts with the Medes and the Persians. Babylon's no longer a problem in the vision in chapter 8. It talks about a ram having two horns. One horn is longer than the other, comes up second, and it's longer than the other. That's the Persians and the Medes. So the Medes and the Persians, if you could imagine Turkey, kind of Greece is over on the western side, and then Turkey kind of goes this way. The western side is Lydia, and you get further over to the eastern side, which is kind of where Iran is. The Persians, or the Medes, were up in the northwest corner of Iran, and the Medes were in the southwest corner of Iran. And so what happened was the big kingdom at the time was the Assyrians. The Assyrians were the people that were coming against Israel in the book of Isaiah. 721 BC, they conquered and took the northern kingdom into slavery. And remember that God sent an angel when they were going to come against Hezekiah and the people in Palestine. He sent an angel who killed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in one night. That was the last great king of Assyria. And he went back home, and his sons killed him. Took 20 years later, his sons killed him. And then the next few kings never really became as great, because there was a lot of civil strife. There was a lot of arguing. There was a lot of back and forth between powers within Assyria and wars on the outside. Sounds like what we're going through in our country. The division and the disruption back and forth, and the separations going on within our country, and the oppositions going on around us. That's what happened to the Assyrians. And so the Persians that were up in the northwest corner of Iran, they were just kind of nomadic tribes. There were Bedouins that went back and forth with their animals. The real strength that they had is they had horses. People weren't using horses very much other than for chariots. But these guys used the horses as cavalry. And they knew how to ride the horses into battle. And so they came together, and they became a confederacy of Medes. And then they conquered the Persians to the south, which was another nomadic bunch of tribes. So they conquered them, and when they conquered them, of course they got on to put their people there. So there was the king and his family of the Medes who were running the country of Media, and they put a relative, not someone in the royal line directly, they put a nephew in power in the Persia. And the son, the next generation, the son was Cyrus the Mede. And Cyrus decided he was going to conquer Media. He's going to conquer the country that his family came from, because he couldn't be king there. Someone else was king there, his cousin. So he conquered the Medes, and that's where the two horns came into being. And the Persians became greater than the Medes. Together, they, with the Babylonians and some other groups, some of the Vandals, or not the Vandals, but the barbarians from the steppes in what is modern-day Russia, they were coming down. There were Scythians and Sumerians, Sumerians with a C. They were coming down, and they all got together against Nineveh, which was falling into decline. They came against Nineveh. Nineveh and the Assyrians. And so they all attacked Nineveh, and in 612 they defeated Nineveh and destroyed Nineveh. And then that's when they started to become trouble for Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar and his father were part of that coalition against Nineveh, and so he had to put down the Persians and the Medes and the other people, get them in their place. So then the Babylonian Empire was in power for about 70 years. They came down and they took the Jewish southern kingdom, Judea, into captivity to Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel was taken into Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar in 605 BC. So now, in the vision, we got the ram, and then we see, so the ram took care, the Medians came and they defeated the Babylonians. I'm getting a little off topic here. So the Babylonians became corrupt. Belshazzar, the last king, he was actually a regent king. His father's name was Nabonidus. And he, for whatever reason, he didn't want to sit in Babylon as the king, so he went to a place in Arabia, and he put his son in charge. That's why when Daniel read the vision or proclaimed the vision about the handwriting on the wall, Belshazzar said, "I'll make you the third ruler in the kingdom," because he was the second ruler. He couldn't make him the first or second ruler because he didn't have that power. So he'd make him the third ruler. So Belshazzar ruled for about 15 years. And Daniel got his vision in the first and third years. So the night that the Babylonians came the Medes came against Babylon was in 539 BC. And they surrounded the city, but the walls of Babylon were immense. They were huge. They were hundreds of feet tall. They were 40 feet abreast. They were just huge. And the Babylonians thought, they can't get in here. There's no way they can get in here. So they weren't taking it seriously. Well, unbeknownst to them, Cyrus dammed up the river and diverted the river so that the river stopped flowing underneath the wall in Babylon, and they were able to march in underneath the wall while all the Babylonians were drunk. They'd been having a feast and a party, and they were all drunk, and they took the city one night, having to hardly kill anybody. And that was the end of the Babylonian Empire. Then Cyrus came into power, and he's the one who allowed the Jews to come back to Palestine. So the Medes were the ram with the two horns. Then what is it, a leopard? No, it's a goat. Goat comes across the ground, hardly touching the ground. Doesn't touch the ground. It comes so quickly. That's Alexander the Great. He's got a very conspicuous horn, one big horn. And he sees the ram, and he attacks the ram, and he breaks its horns, and he throws it on the ground, he tramples it, he destroys it. That's what Alexander the Great did. He was amazing. He started at 17 years old. He went from Macedon all the way down to Egypt and all the way over to India. And he died at age 33. He'd conquered all that area. And he was unstoppable. He was a brilliant strategist. And his men, he had men that were highly trained, and they were, just like it said, they were full of rage. They would come in and they would just decimate their enemies. So the description of what the goat did to the ram, it fits very well with Alexander the Great. Well, then you notice his horn got broken, and 4 horns grew up. Those are those four generals of Alexander the Great. And then it says in the latter time of their reign. So these generals reigned for a period of time. There's several generations of generals, or of rulers, I should say, in the Seleucus dynasty and the Ptolemies. Several generations. The one that's the little horn is Antiochus IV. Antiochus IV. He took the name Epiphanes. Epiphanes means the manifestation of God. He called himself God made visible. His detractors called him Epimanes, which means madman. They could see clearly what was going on. So the thing that's interesting about him is it talks about him being skilled at intrigue, being crafty. He, just like Darius, or just like Cyrus, was not supposed to be the king. The king in his place, in the area of Turkey, was he had a son who was held captive in Rome. The Romans were becoming powerful, and they had required that the heir apparent come and be held as a hostage to make sure that those people didn't betray Rome. And so Antiochus he had actually been in that place. He was put in that place to be a hostage, and then when they demanded the heir apparent to become the hostage, he was released. He was living in Athens at the time, and his brother was the king. One of his brothers was the king, and his brother was assassinated. So he hurried back, and he came to the capital, and he sold himself as the next king. What he did is he said, I will rule in place of my cousin who's in Rome until he comes back. And he had an infant son, and so he said, and if his son grows up and becomes old enough to become king, I'll step down. Well, people were okay with that, but that was never his intention at all. He made arrangements so the Romans would not release his cousin, and his infant nephew mysteriously died. So he became the unopposed king of that dynasty. And he made his capital in a city named after himself, Antioch of Syria, the same one that's in the New Testament, where the believers were first called Christians in Acts 11, was named after Antioch. Laodicea, the town we read about in the book of Revelation, is named after one of the wives of these Antiochuses. There's a whole bunch of them. He's the number 4. So Laodicea was the woman that Laodicea was named after. So anyway, what happens is Antiochus he hears that the Ptolemies are going to come up from the south and attack him, because there's this rivalry back and forth between the southern Egyptian kingdom and the northern kingdom that's in Turkey, and he heard they were going to come up against him, so he set up some fortifications, and he got his men in place, and the Egyptians didn't know about it. So they came up, and they got creamed. Antiochus was ready for him, and he beat him bad, and went down, and he captured Ptolemy, and he knew that if he removed Ptolemy, he'd have trouble with the Romans. The Romans were off fighting another war at the time, but they let their presence be known. So he decided he'd leave Ptolemy in place to be a puppet king, but he had to be answerable to him. And then he left. Well, then Ptolemy wasn't doing everything he should be doing. So he came back 2 years later, and he was going to capture them again. He gets down to Egypt, and he's met by one old Roman ambassador. And he says, I need to know if you're going to obey the will of Rome or whether you're going to declare war on Rome. If you attack Ptolemy, that's war on Rome. And Antiochus said, well, let me go talk to my counselors and I'll get back to you. And the Roman senator or ambassador came, and he drew a circle in the sand around Antiochus. And he said, if you step outside that circle without giving me an answer, I'm considering that as war against Rome. So he humiliated Antiochus because he was left with no choice. And so he agreed to not attack Ptolemy. He's heading back home, and he's madder than a hornet. And he comes up to Jerusalem. Now, he'd already had an agenda with Jerusalem. He was one of the people that was trying to make everybody that he conquered into Greek-speaking people. They called him a Hellenizer. He was trying to make people like Greeks. So he had already put a high priest in position in Jerusalem. While all this turmoil was going on between him fighting Ptolemy, there had been a shuffle that went on, and that high priest was removed, and some other guy, a Jewish traditionalist, took over. And since he was already in a bad mood, Antiochus decided he was going to straighten this out. So he went to Jerusalem. He killed the usurper, and he put his own guy back in there. And he killed 40,000 men, women, and children in 3 days. And he sent another 40,000 into slavery as punishment. And he forbid any Jewish rites. They couldn't sacrifice to Yahweh anymore. And he offered a pig on an altar in the temple. He desolated the temple. So we're going to see the phrase, the abomination that desolates, come up a number of times. He's the first one that did that. Now, as we talk about these prophecies, it's important for us to remember that these are pictures, these are things that happened, but they seem to have reflections in history. They seem to happen, they come around again. It's a spiritual dynamic that comes around again. A modern day example of this is the book, The New Jim Crow. You see the same thing going on with the people that were enslaved. Then after the Civil War, the Jim Crow laws kept them under bondage and under restrictions. And then even with the civil rights movements, now we got the mass incarceration. And people, many of those men are in jails working for nothing. And they're supporting other people who have businesses that are based on having their own prisons. And so the same dynamic, you see the same, it's kind of like the same dynamic is put on different generations and it's repeated. Well, that's what goes on here with Antiochus. Antiochus is the little horn with the big mouth, making these great boasts. He opposed God, he opposed the commander of the host, he opposed the prince of princes by coming in and defiling the temple and forbidding the Jewish practices. He came against God. He's not the first one, and he won't be the last one. So he gets all this going, and then he hears there's an attack going on by the Parthians, which are up in the eastern part of his territory. So he leaves, and he leaves this guy in charge, Lysias. And while he's gone, they're carrying out his wishes, and they're demanding that people pay taxes, and they have to honor the Greek gods. And there's an old guy, I can't remember his first name. He's the first of the Maccabees anyway. The first Simon. I can't remember his name. Anyway, he refuses, and he kills the representative who's going to demand that they disavow their allegiance to God. It starts a rebellion in Judea, and his son Judas became known as the Maccabee, the hammer. And he led this guerrilla movement against the Greeks that were in charge, and eventually defeated them and reinstated the temple. They cleansed the temple, and they started the sacrifices. So in this prophecy here, it mentions how long will the regular sacrifice be stopped? How long before it's restored? And it mentions 2,300 mornings and evenings. 2,300 mornings and evenings. Well, people have tried to interpret that in different ways. They think, well, maybe that's years. They think maybe that's days. They don't know what to think about it. But we know from the book of Maccabees that the temple was defiled in 167 BC on the, if I remember right, the 15th of Kislev, which is basically December. It's November, December. And it was reestablished, and sacrifices were offered again on the 25th of Kislev in 164. So a little over 3 years. Well, if you take our calendar and you figure it out, it doesn't work out. But if you take the calendar that the Greeks were using at the time and the Jews were using, they had 30-day months, 12 months to a year, and every few years they added an extra month to keep it even. So, and in Judea, the high priest determined when this extra month would go in. So if you do 360 times 3, you get 1080. If you add 2 months, that's 60 more. That's 1040, or 1140. And then the days from the 15th to the 25th, that's 1150 days. Well, the key is to understand that the morning and the evenings are referring to sacrifices. The morning sacrifice and the evening sacrifice. So literally, there are 2,300 morning and evening sacrifices that were abandoned, and at the end of that 2,300, God reinstituted the sacrifice again. Just to show the detail of these prophecies. There's no way that Daniel could have imagined that or could have possibly predicted anything like that. It shows God's foreknowledge, God knowing the future, and His control. He's involved. He's involved in what's happening. So as we look at these passages, it's important for us to recognize that there's a historical thing, and there's also other things that are being hinted at. It talks about some of this stuff being sealed up because it refers to things in the future. So this is not the end of the story. It's one chapter in a template that's going to repeat in history. Anybody have any questions?
Is there going to be a test?
No.